Bradley retired from a county sheriff's department in Indiana and moved to northern Arizona several years back. It was a hot night on Election Day, November 3rd, 2020. Living alone, it was up to him to take out the trash. Now, stepping out of the house, he suddenly realized that the usual chatter of insects was now dead silent. He was looking around, listening with an erudite ear for any sign of a creature lurking about in the dark, revealing nothing. When his eyes finally surveyed his surroundings enough that he felt sure there was no immediate threat, he looked up to enjoy the nightly sight of the moon and stars. Instead, all he saw was pitch black. He sat the garbage bag down and stepped off the porch to examine this strange phenomenon more closely with an insouciant curiosity. That was when he realized why he could not see the stars. About 150 yards above him was a silently floating huge black triangle. Now, this thing was large enough to easily hold a couple of Walmart Supercenter stores side by side and still have room to play a regulation football game. He estimated that it was moving about 5 to 10 miles an hour. Now, additionally, he was amazed that he could not hear a sound. The triangle finally moved far enough away from him to where he could see the back end of it. 4 square, equally spaced portals fit perfectly across the width and height of the ship's back end. He knew a tremendous amount of heat was being expelled from these portals, and he felt a sense of perfidy that something so momentous had been kept secret. But the distortion soon faded as it got further away. Now, early on, he knew that he was seeing something that would rock this planet. He pulls out his smartphone to make a video of this. He wanted to display this phenomenon through a close-up video of a slow-moving triangle UFO. He would astound the world. He had never had the opportunity like this before, and he would take it. He quickly planned to make this video on his phone. He would then download it on his computer and send it to everybody he knew. A voice somehow entered his head, along with a corresponding images of men in black who seemed to carry a protean ability to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The message was clear. The video would never make it to the internet because he and his phone would be seized by the men in black and never be seen again. It was then he realized why the insects were so silent, and it was because the men in black were watching him in the darkness, his eyes quickly surveying his surroundings, and he still could not see anything in the dead silence of the dark, but had the creepiest feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, his head began to ache slightly as a deep, uncomfortable dread and anxiety swept over him. He slowly slipped his phone back into his pocket, watched the triangle slowly float over the city, and it then rose into the sky until it joined all the other sparkling stars in the night. That was when the insect chatter suddenly filled his ears again. Somehow, the ship left without making a sound. Bradley then grabbed his trash bag, threw it in the bin for tomorrow's pickup, and he makes his way home but had difficulty sleeping that whole night because his headache just did not go away until about noon the following day. Bradley will always remember this experience, especially what he saw. He also spent many hours trying to figure out how they mentally communicated with him, and he knows he is safe from the men in black since they forced him into a position where his only evidence of what happened that night was his word. So long as he possesses no concrete evidence, he is not a threat. Now, strangely, to the best of his knowledge, no reports of this UFO ever hit the news, nor were they talked about on the local radio stations. It's very difficult for him to believe that absolutely no one else saw this huge ship. This whole situation leaves him puzzled, and he wonders how close he came to be one of the many who left their houses one night to take out the trash, never to be seen again. Now, this next encounter was submitted by Walt. Walt and his 16-year-old son Blake live on a rather large farm in the middle of nowhere, and it's around 50 acres of fields and trees and a safe neighborhood where nobody really locks their doors because they don't have to. Now, Blake seemed scared of what lies in those woods. When he was younger, Walt noticed that he always locked the windows in his room, and he felt a bit out of it, but didn't think there was too much to worry about. This last summer, Walt noticed that Blake was coating the windowsills in his room with salt. Walt knew it meant that Blake was trying to keep something out. When Walt asked Blake about it, he just said, "There are things out there." Now, Walt believes in the supernatural, but at the time thought that Blake was just trying to scare him. Walt has seen and heard his fair share of strange things, but never felt like he was in any danger. This particular summer, Walt set up an outdoor projector to watch movies. He mounted the screen to a permanent fixture, and when they were finished, would just put the projector away each night. Now, sometimes they would sit out there all night watching movies or TV shows, and they would hear noises, like owls or foxes and coyotes, but nothing that felt out of the ordinary. Then, one night at about 2 a.m, Walt started hearing a clicking noise. It sounded kind of like the pops of electricity, like something, had short-circuited, maybe. He thought that maybe the projector was possibly overheating, so he pauses the movie and looks toward the noise. It was coming from the deep grass and getting louder. It was far too dark for him to be able to really see anything. So Blake looked back at the grass, and it seemed like he could see something that Walt could not. He then simply said, "It's the Glimmer Man." And he seemed too nervous but not too scared. The sound suddenly stopped. Walt was admittedly a bit freaked out, but tried to push it out of his mind. Again, he assumed that Blake was messing with him. Walt didn't really know what he was talking about, and he had never heard of such a thing, the Glimmer Man. But a few days later, he was met with genuine terror. It was relatively late, around 3 a.m. I guess you could call that early. They had just finished another movie night and were preparing for bed when Walt had the realization he had left his phone outside. So, going to retrieve it would mean walking outside in the dark behind his house, since that's where the projector screen was set up. Now, he was a bit scared, and so he just walked outside and had just stepped off the porch when he noticed it. The flashlight he was using was shining back at him, and it was pointed into the front yard, but it wasn't lighting up that area. It was like it was hitting something and reflecting back at him. Now, suddenly, whatever was causing this either moved or disappeared because his light suddenly began illuminating the ground as it should be. Now, it wasn't raining that night, and nothing caused this. There was grass and dirt. He decided his phone wasn't worth facing whatever was out there and that he would get in the morning instead. Now later, he decided to look up the Glimmer Man and see what he could find. While his sighting wasn't perfect based on the descriptions he found, it did fit. Now when he saw this creature, it wasn't deep in the woods, it was right in his own yard, which scared him. Now after the sighting, he started hearing strange screeching noises. He tried putting up a trail cam in an attempt to catch something, and he had a lot of technical issues with it and finally gave up, though he is planning to try again. Now, Walt's real first interaction with this being happened in July. It has been 6 months now, and he still hears it sometimes. Out there are cries, scratching, banging, and they always seem to be these faint little noises that almost seem unreal. Blake tells him that the creature likes candy, something he thought he had never heard before. He bought a couple of bags to leave out on the porch. Starburst, Skittles, M&Ms maybe? What do you guys think? Have you ever heard of a Glimmer Man, and where does it come from? Does it even like candy? But before we begin with Jim's story, he has requested, as is common in Australia, to pay his respects to the traditional Indigenous Australian owners upon the land of which he speaks of, the Darkinjung. Now, if I'm pronouncing that wrong, forgive me because I am not Australian. Now, Jim lives close to a city called Gosford, which is between Sydney and Newcastle in New South Wales, Australia. Now, this is kind of a laid-back coastal region, popular because it is a place with an ocean and the opportunity to relax in laid-back Aussie fashion. Let's get to the deep dive, so to speak. Now, Jim was out on a late-night drive looking for something to do alone, something to pique his interest as he couldn't stand going to bars or clubbing. And he remembered the beautiful bush track that he had begun many times throughout his life. And he liked the idea of a twilight hike, or so they call it down there, just to see what nocturnal creatures might be out. And it wasn't long before he was treated to a fox, and it took off pretty quickly, despite the freaky-looking eyes. Now, he eventually reached the top of the trail and began the descent through the beautiful and almost domed exterior of this absolute gem of a forest. His first stop was an area known as Seymour Pond. Now, this pond was created many years ago to support a few non-existent farms, but you will find the occasional water bird inhabiting the area. He couldn't feel more at peace. This, being so close to his own grandmother's property, it truly felt like home in a strange way. Like his bloodline was somehow tied to this magical area. Now, around 11 p.m., there was minimal light except for the odd shade of moonlight shining through the branches. He begins trailing around Seymour Pond in the direction he was familiar with, which led to the Waterman's Walk area. Now, this area has a small resting spot for hikers, and as he was snaking his way through, he begins to hear rustling from behind him. And he was so startled it felt like his heart had nearly leapt out of his chest. He didn't know if somebody was joking with him or if he was about to be murdered, and so he swiftly turns around to see the tail of a swamp wallaby darting through the brush. And just as he turned to look back in the direction he was heading, he was met with something he could only describe as an odor you would find at a landfill. He felt aromatically punched in the face to the point of being nearly choked. However, he could not identify the source, and it seemed to be concentrated in this little 5-foot area. Curiosity got the best of him. He wanted to trace the smell source and figured it must have been the swamp wallaby. After all, what else could it be? So he slowly began to wander up a moderately tricky incline, which was aligned on each side with prickly-type plants. He was keenly aware of his surroundings, but saw nothing. And then he smelt that same odor again, and as he began to smell it, he heard the scratching sound. He then sees a large hand from above a bunch of tall bushes. The figure then emerges, scratching its head, its furry head. And all he could do was stay absolutely still. He refused to even blink for fear it may have some super hearing. And he wondered for that moment if he could be possibly looking at one of Australia's most elusive creatures, the yowie, which is similar to Bigfoot, but just in Australia, if you didn't know. And he also wondered if he was losing his mind from fatigue and letting his mind play tricks on him. Now, this figure, which he could only guess was 7 feet tall and solidly built, began to inspect its immediate surroundings as if frantically searching for food. Now, thankfully, it never turned in his direction. To be safe, he waited a good 10 minutes to give it space. To say that he sprinted back to his car was an understatement. He sustained an old ankle injury from turf hockey, which made running painful. Now, at this point, however, he wasn't really thinking about anything but survival. Once back in his car, he did not even feel safe, as the area was entirely surrounded by this thick bush. And it wasn't until he made it back to the main highway that he felt some level of comfort, at least. Now we move on to talk about Carrie's Shadow Man or Hat Man encounter. Now, Carrie's story took place in August of '98. Her father had been battling lymphoma for about 8 months, and while he appeared to be in remission, the truth was that he is not. Now, for those of you that don't know what lymphoma is, it is a type of cancer. Now, the night before he passed, he was admitted to the hospital, and not wanting him to be alone, Carrie and her grandmother took the first shift of staying up with him. Now, the following morning at 7 in the morning, her mom and aunt came to stay with him, and she dropped her grandma off at home and then went home to go get some sleep herself. Now, her then husband kept their 16-month-old daughter busy while she slept, but she could still hear them from time to time in the living room. Her 2 German shepherds were napping with her, but the bedroom door was open, so they could freely go in and out as they pleased. Now, she passed out from exhaustion almost immediately. She had a lot on her plate at this time. I mean, she wasn't just tired from sleep deprivation. Her parents relied heavily on her as the only child, and her mom had a hard time coping with this illness. Now, Carrie helped as much as possible, working full-time, attending school full-time, and having a toddler at home. And for any of you out there who have that situation, you have my full respect, and I understand how tough that is. Now, something woke her up at some point in the late morning or very early afternoon. She was not sure what it was, but looked over at her bedside clock, then back up at the ceiling, debating whether or not she should get up. Now, she could hear her husband and daughter in the living room, and the dogs were no longer in the bedroom. She immediately felt strange, like something was wrong. Beyond what was happening with her dad, she had the same feeling as a small child who was terrified of the dark. Only it wasn't dark. It was midday. She became aware of a soft clicking sound. Now, it took her a few seconds to realize it was the unfamiliar sound, and at that moment she saw him peek around the corner from the hallway. And he was upside down with his hands and knees on the ceiling. He was a man in miniature scale, probably about 2.5 to 3 feet tall, in a suit and brimmed hat. The hat was similar to that of a Mexican sombrero, but smaller, and while he was 3D, he was entirely a black shadow. At first, she was in disbelief, but that quickly turned to terror. So much so that she suddenly could not scream or even move, because he crawls into the room like he wasn't expecting to be seen, and then, once he gets a few feet into the room, he looked down in her direction. He then stopped like he was surprised she could see him. He then begins crawling closer to her bed and closer, looking down at her the entire time as if he was almost curious about how she could see him. Now, she tried to scream and tried to move, but was so frozen in absolute raw terror and in total disbelief that this was even happening. She tells herself that she had to be dreaming or dead. Although it did not feel like a dream, it was real, it was reality, it was happening now. Now, she could hear her husband and daughter watching TV the entire time this was going on. Now, suddenly, the phone rings, and she heard her husband get up to answer it. She then sat up straight in her bed, and the shadow thing was then gone, and so was the clicking. Now, her husband enters the bedroom, and she immediately knew why, without him having to say a word. Her aunt had called to say their father had passed away. Now, the Shadow Man encounter immediately escaped her mind for the next few days while they were coordinating funeral arrangements and dealing with emotional grief. This incident was more than 20 years ago, but she recently thought about it again after her now adult daughter had a sleep paralysis incident. Her experience brought up memories of the event. Now, Carrie believes this is a non-human entity. She feels that these entities feed on human emotions, such as pain or fear, and that this specific entity fed off sadness and grief and was there because of the feelings she was going through at the time. Carrie would like to know if any of our subscribers have had a similar encounter, particularly with a shadow man in miniature or another grief eater. Or if you've experienced a clicking noise during an encounter, please let me know what you think down in the comments below. It's now time to talk about the encounters that Veronica has shared. This first event happened in the middle of Mexico in Michoacan in the early 80s. Veronica was a very energetic little girl who was never scared of anything and was very independent. Now, in those days, you could freely go anywhere without supervision. And one evening around 6 p.m., when it was beginning to get dark, Veronica followed her older sister and her sister's boyfriend around. The three ended up at the top part of the house where everybody at the apartment complex would hang clothes to dry. There was a set of twirling iron steps to get to the top, and while climbing the steps, she felt something looking at her. She froze and put her back against the wall, and amid the darkness, a pair of red, bright eyes appeared. Whatever this thing was, it was breathing like a bull, and she could see the steam from its breathing in the glow of its eyes. Now, she also immediately noticed a putrid odor. Sulfur or rotten flesh, she couldn't tell, but it stung her nostrils to the point that her eyes began to water. Still frozen, she felt the hair on her neck, which seemed to make an electrical sound, and as she continued to look at this being, this demon, it looked back at her and became noticeably more agitated. She finally mustered up the courage to scream, and she thought this entity would take her. A second scream alerted her parents as they came around the hall to the steps. She was petrified and baffled as it looked like this thing had horns, turned back like a ram or a demon with giant bat-like wings. Its eyes were what had the most significant effect on her. When her brother picked her up, he said that her body was stiff, her eyes were wide open, and she was freezing cold. Now, somehow, through all of this, nobody else saw a thing. She had a fever for several days afterward, and while they don't know what really happened, her mother had an idea. Veronica's mother told her that things like this happened where she was from and that she just needed to forget it. Veronica told her about the foul smell, and her mother hugged her for a while, assuring her that it was gone. Veronica forgot about it for many years until she began hearing others tell similar stories, and just like that, after 28 years, it all came back to her. She can once again not get this event out of her mind. In fact, she recently told her now husband about the encounter, and he told her that two of his aunts had the exact same thing happen to them when they were about the age. The aunts had to go to the river in the afternoon to wash up before bedtime, and both of them saw a gigantic being with red eyes that smelt disgusting. One of the young women fainted, and the other one had the same reaction Veronica had, freezing up. The only difference was that they had no trouble screaming right away. Now, when Veronica happened to look into it, it turned out that the event with her husband's aunt took place not too far from where her experience had been. Now, Veronica has been in the U.S. since this happened. Would she have experienced this again had they not moved? What do you guys think? Now, Veronica's second encounter story started when she went to pick up her teen son from his night shift at a local grocery store. It was roughly 1 a.m. on a cold night in January. As she drove, they were both talking and laughing about stuff that happened on his shift. Now, suddenly, they saw a light in the sky, which was way too big and fast to be a chopper. Besides that, this light had quickly changed direction and appeared to be headed directly at them. The light passed on top of them, illuminating the inside of the car. She pulls over, parks on the side of the road, and they thought for sure that this craft was headed straight for them. Instead, however, when Veronica followed it, she saw that it disappeared on a small mountain called Little Mountain. Now, after this happened, she pulled back onto the road, and the rest of their trip was met with silence. Now, here is where things get really strange. About 3 years later, Miley Cyrus was on the same road after performing at a local casino. Miley thought it was a paparazzi helicopter, but soon realized that that could not be possible. Is this a spot, a hot spot for extraterrestrial sightings? Has anyone ever heard of this location, E Street in San Bernardino, California, as being known for UFO sightings? Let me know what you think in the comments down below. Now, let's now hear about what Mason experienced when he was a teenager. One night, when he was around 18, he was lying in bed waiting on a phone call. He had the phone beside him and was staring up at the ceiling when he suddenly felt a draft. It was the kind of draft you feel when you open the door and a breeze hits you, except there weren't any doors open. Now, Mason turned his head toward the room door, thinking that it was his brother walking in, but what he saw was a shadow figure like mist. It was a figure, and it was like hovering, like it was going to go past his door. Then as he continues looking at it, the being turns toward him. It sees that Mason is looking at it, and it seems mad, and its bright red eyes are something no one could ever forget. He was so scared because he felt it was evil. And suddenly it starts to hover toward him, and he wants to scream, but he's also so afraid of waking up his family because he figures there has to be some explanation for this. And it gets right up next to him, and he tries to scream, and it jumps on top of him, and he could feel the weight, but now he can't see it. He continues to be unable to scream or move. It's almost like he can hear himself trying to scream for what seems like 10 seconds, if not more. Then, just as quickly as it started, he felt the figure move off of him. And once he could finally move, he jumps up, runs to his grandmother's room to tell her exactly what happened. There's not a day that he doesn't think about what happened that day, particularly those red eyes. That was when Mason knew that there were things on Earth that we could not understand. Have you had something similar happen? Let me know what you think. Now, our final story today was submitted by Aiden. As he was settling into his new flat with a couple of friends, he couldn't quite shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It began when he worked in the shop below the flat, and he always felt a constant urge to leave. The basement in particular seemed to give off an unsettling energy, and he always felt on edge when he was down there all alone. The building had been around since the 1800s, so he just assumed he was being paranoid. However, there was this old photograph in the office with a family that he had found a bit unsettling. Now, one day, the group of friends decided to go watch football at the pub, leaving their female friend behind to relax at home. When they returned, she was visibly shaken and had told them that she had felt someone touch her shoulder while she was watching TV. They tried to reassure her that it was all in her head, but it was clear that she was terrified she would never remain in that flat alone at night after that. Now, a few weeks go by, and another one of his friends claimed to have had his feet grabbed in bed. Mason was skeptical, rightfully so, but this person insisted that something strange was going on in the flat. To make them feel better, Mason suggested they turn on the lights in the hallway at night just to see what happens. At this point, Mason still thought they were all suffering from overactive imaginations and paranoia. He always has been agnostic when it comes to the supernatural. But that's when he saw it for himself, footsteps in the light under the door walking down the hallway. Now, this happened at a time when no one had left their room. This continued for weeks on end with noises and footsteps in the hallway at night and the feeling of someone watching them at all times. One night, he awoke to a figure of a woman staring at him intensely from the window. He was frozen in place, unable to move as she looked him with piercing eyes. He reaches for his phone to shine the light on her, and she disappears. The feeling of unease that washed over him in that moment was indescribable. They tried to carry on as normal, but the strange events persisted. They decided to leave the flat after about 6 months' time, even though money was tight. It's still unclear to him what causes these unsettling occurrences. What he does know is that living in that flat was a truly terrifying experience, and he knew he was not alone. Never being able to relax took its toll on their friendships, and they rarely speak about those events. They were all glad to have been out of that flat, and had they had more money at their disposal, they would have gotten out of there much sooner. But more importantly, I want to know what you guys think. So be sure to go ahead and leave a comment down below, and also smack that like button. And if you enjoy this kind of content, be sure to go ahead and smack that subscribe button too. And as always, guys, I love you all. Keep an open mind, and I'll check you guys out in the very next video.